Imagine if members of Mick Lynch's RMT union went on strike demanding a 40-hour working week, and the Labour government, instead of welcoming their demands, decided to spy on them. Well, that's what actually happened in 1966 under Prime Minister Harold Wilson, the Labour Party leader who Keir Starmer most admires. Now, this spying on trade unions has been revealed in files from MI5, whose headquarters is behind me and my colleague Richard Norton-Taylor, the author of the books State of Secrecy and Blacklist. Now, Richard, you worked for The Guardian for many years as their defence and security editor, and you now write for Declassified, and you've just written a fascinating article about this scandal of MI5 spying on trade unions at the behest of a Labour government. Can you just take our viewers back to 1966 and why this strike was happening in the first place?
Well, the National Union of Seamen in 1966, Harold Wilson's first big Labour dispute actually facing the Labour Prime Minister, was a dockers strike really. Harold Wilson was worried about the effect on the balance of payments, on trade and so on. MI5 officials, with the help of the police special branch, bugged the dockers leaders and also had informants inside the unions. Ironic thing about this strike was that there were very few communists involved. One or two of the ad hoc local strike committees included openly acknowledged members of the Communist Party. Their names appear in all these voluminous files by MI5. The head of MI5 at the time, Sir Martin Furnival Jones, 1966, reported in his colleagues in MI5 how he was, Wilson warmly, the Prime Minister warmly welcomed and appreciated our reports. Perversely, the Communist Party had very little influence, Communist Party members, in the strike. And but that worried MI5 because if there's no reason really to back their case that communists were behind this strike, that would mean that the Prime Minister would say, well, we don't need your reports anymore. But the strikes were settled pretty soon, actually. Harold Wilson specifically said, the strike, the NUS strike, the dockers strike in 1966 may be over, but please continue reporting to my ministers on any kind of hint of future industrial action and what the trade union leaders are up to.
And that culture of spying on the left, of course, extended from trade unions to the peace movement, CND, and other kind of environmental activist groups. Undercover police had relationships with women in these groups. Now that led to some kind of backlash from the public, and in order to allow undercover operations to carry on, the last Conservative government passed the so-called Spy Cops Bill, which was very unpopular on the left. But one of Keir Starmer's first kind of controversial acts as leader of the opposition after he took over from Jeremy Corbyn was to push, vote in support of this Spy Cops Bill, quite kind of, in a very kind of deliberate fashion to show where he stood on this matter and his position vis-a-vis the secret states.
Yes.
But I mean, this culture of spying on the left. I mean, how hard has it been for us to, as journalists, to find out about it? Because, why are MI5 giving some files to the archives? Are they legally obliged to do that? Is this kind of a PR stunt?
It's more of a PR stunt actually. But there's no sort of pattern. Haphazardly, every few years, they produced a whole load of files. And they tried to attract journalists, saying how wonderfully we are attracting these genuine threats to national security, like the Cambridge spy ring of the Second World War, for example, and titillates a lot of journalists and so on. But although I have to say that most of my the evidence have come out in court cases, really, which or whistleblowers, and they showed in the 80s how the MI5, for example, pursuing CND activists and members of the National Council for Civil Liberties, now Liberty, anyone who's regarded by them as any kind of threat to, quote, national security, unquote. And of course, this means anyone who is got a friend, for example, who is a member of the Communist Party, like the CND, one member was a member of the Communist Party, that means all his calls to all sorts of other people, including MPs, have got to be monitored. And it's, I say it's a complete, even at the time, it regarded a complete waste of time. These people were no threat to national security, as the spy cops people who are chasing, animal rights people and so on and so forth. There's no, and the more general point really is that, and one or two Labour MPs were, of course. One called Niall McDermott, who Wilson wanted to be Solicitor General. He was a very respected human rights lawyer. His wife, an Italian, who had been having to run a resistance group in the Second World War, and of course some of the resistance people in Italy were Communist Party members at the time. But this particular resistance group was run by Catholic priests, actually, helping Allied prisoners, including some Russians, to escape. And the only people, as Niall McDermott told me once in a letter, he said that the only people this resistance group didn't employ or didn't have any contacts with were fascists. So there was a kind of witch hunt, really, a kind of incipient McCarthyism, not as bad as as blatant as the American one, of course, where they had congressional committees and so on, Edgar Hoover and FBI and so on in the US. But it does show how MI5 were chasing people who were not threats to national security at all. Nowadays, MI5 say it is very difficult to chase and to discover who the real threats, real terrorists are. Islamists or extremists who've perpetrated some attacks, of course, some years in Britain. But they complain, MI5 people and spy watchers or hunters, that they're so much more difficult to increasingly difficult to find the needles in a haystack. But I say they're building more and more haystacks.
Well, exactly. I mean, when you look at the files that they have released to the National Archives, I mean, their remit of spying on the Communist Party meant that even things like Christmas cards to left-wing academics were being intercepted and copied and kept on file for 50 years.
That's right.
But do you think that the Labour Party of today has a better approach towards civil liberties than Harold Wilson did in the 1960s, or do you think we are in quite a draconian period?
Well, I think the culture, all the evidence is, I mean, it's not really talked openly by Keir Starmer and the cabinet, of course, but there is that there's still a defensive-ness, a concern that, my God, is national security going to be threatened? Is there going to be some kind of attack, for example, on Britain? And instead of actually concentrating on real terrorists, for example, as I said, the Manchester Arena bombing, there was an inquiry into that. And a judge, actually one of those damning criticisms of MI5, said it didn't tell the whole truth to the inquiry into that Manchester Arena bombing, but and knew about the Libyan-based perpetrator, who was a suicide bomber, actually, was on the MI5's radar for some time, but they let him slip. Now, you can't get everybody, of course. It's not just thing as total security, but the amount of time they spend, this sort of paranoia, which is reflected in, I think, in number 10 now in the governments, because they say this is our job, Prime Minister, watch out for X, Y, and Z, and therefore we need more money and so on and so forth. Have a vested interest, without being too cynical about it, they have a vested interest in winding up ministers, and all evidence, in answer to your question, suggests that Keir Starmer is on the defensive in that, and partly because, well, he uses his role in the past as Director of Public Prosecution, so I know about the real threats. I know, for example, on anything to do with civil liberties, on anti-protest laws, for example, everyone assumed that Labour would drop some of those pretty draconian laws introduced by the Conservative government, and he's kept them.
Well, thank you, Richard, for writing this article for us. If you're watching this video but you haven't read the article, we'll put a link in the description below. You can also subscribe to this channel if you haven't already to help this coverage reach a wider audience. At Declassified, we're one of the only media outlets putting a critical lens on the UK security and intelligence agencies, looking at how they are intruding on civil liberties, often negligent or overreaching in their powers. So if you like the journalism that we do at Declassified, please like this video, leave a comment below and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.